I'm Kira. I am an investor here at B Partners. B invests in frontier technologies, which include blockchain, but also computer vision, human computer interaction, which includes things like chatbots, space, drones, you name it, things on the cutting edge we get excited about. And then we've also looked quite a bit at marketplaces and a particular business model called market networks. And we are pre-seed investors. We often like to lead rounds and have done that in over 50% of our teams. And we have a partnership model, which fits well into what your mission is with Silicon Valley Forum, because we like to support our entrepreneurs to get from 0 to 1 and to get to their next fundraise or tackle their next big rock or achieve their next big milestone, or et cetera, et cetera. There's all kinds of ways we like to get hands-on and get our hands dirty and support our teams. So that's a little bit about B Partners. In 2017, over $6 billion in total was raised via ICOs. And so it's an emerging technology. Like I mentioned, we focus in that space. Blockchain is just another technology, but it's something that is impossible to ignore as any kind of investor. And so my team and I talked and decided we really need to dig deep because there's a lot to know. And I led our efforts into defining our perspective. And through that process, I wrote an investment white paper, and ultimately that led to our first investment in the space. And then what I can tell you even more beyond that, we had an insight with this team that we invested in, which were experienced founders. They had had exits. They knew very well the industry that they were coming from and trying to disrupt with blockchain. And nonetheless, because of the challenges that come with blockchain, they were facing like governance questions and questions about minting a token and what it looks like to distribute new tokens over the course of X years. Just big questions that I think really all founders, I haven't talked to all founders, but I'm pretty sure all of them are dealing with the same things. And it was just amazing to say, wow, these really well-resourced founders actually need just as much support as founders that are not as experienced. These founders, more than any other founder looking at other technologies, really need support. And when you go to do an ICO, you're raising money from the public, but you're not getting structured support that often traditional financing will provide. And so we wanted to support these founders. And then at the end of this, on May 11th, we have an awards night where these founders will pitch. We've got awesome partners like Blockchain Capital and Blockchain at Berkeley, Linda Shee from Scalar Capital, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to, through an academy of judges that are experts in the space and just creating a really cool format for an event, we're going to invest in one of them. And then also one of them will receive mentorship from Fluffy Pony from Monero, which is a top 5 coin. And so as you can tell, we've taken really an interest in supporting founders in this space and think it's really important. And also are just having fun getting deeper ourselves because we have seen so many interesting innovations through our the process of creating this event series. One thing to point out, and this happens to work well with B Partners because we're pre-seed investors, but I would say that most blockchain teams are at the pre-seed stage because they're pre-product, pre-revenue. They haven't built anything yet. Most of them just have white papers, right? So I think it's an interesting juxtaposition of every stage of investor wanting to get involved, and then the stage that these investors are used to investing at often does not match the stage of these teams. So inherently, there is a bit of a disconnect there, or it's a new challenge for some of these investors that haven't been looking as early on. Yeah. So that comes up first. Like I mentioned, this is the first time that retail investors have gotten in before institutions. So there's quite a bit of FOMO and investors wanting to make sure that they find their place in the market. And now what we're also seeing is private rounds and SAFs and private sales to just accredited investors. So it's placing the power balance a little bit back to the accredited investors. And part of that's because yes, they've got more money and that might feel unfair to give them influence, but also they can bear risk more readily and more and in a safer way. So that's also a trend that's happening more and more. And another thing to mention is that if it was a study from Deloitte, something like 90% of the ICOs in the first 3 months of this year failed. I could share the actual statistic. It came from an article, but that another perspective as an investor that I have is most of what we're seeing has a lot of risk and probably greater risk than the average team we're looking at, and that's because the technology is newer or less proven out. There's so many challenges surrounding the technology right now that even the biggest players out there haven't solved. So there's just a lot more uncertainty in that department, and then I think another piece here, there's a lot of new markets that are being created, which I really are fascinating and very exciting. And then on the other hand, there's the ability to disrupt an existing market. And if you're doing that, as a VC, the founders that I'm looking for are the founders that have a deep market insight. And this is B partners in general. We are looking for deep market insights, but especially in this case, hey, where's your deep market insight? Where are you coming from industry where you know this inside out, where now that you understand this industry so well, then you can actually disrupt it. And without that deep understanding, that I wouldn't want to invest. It's a tough question. I don't think anyone probably has an exact number. I was looking at CoinMarketCap today, and there's 1,591 tokens that they're tracking. I've also heard a number like there's over 3,000. So it's hard to say. I would also then shift around what you're asking and say, well, how many are out there? But then also how many have active users and how many have actually taken off? And I would argue there's just a handful that have any degree of scale. And so Stellar is an example of one, and they have 300,000 accounts, and they're basically acting like a bank, but they're doing so for digital currency. And so these different anchors have sets of IOUs where actually when I work with a Stellar currency, I can send you a transaction in 3 to 5 seconds, where actually with Bitcoin and other tokens right now, even though that's the intended goal, that speed, it's not happening because of scalability or XYZ reason. And so Stellar, anyways, is an interesting example, and they actually have some degree of scale. Obviously, there's Bitcoin that has, I don't have the exact number right now, but has the most mass adoption. There's an example, Saya, which is cloud storage and distributed peer-to-peer cloud storage. And the max number of users that they can handle right now is between 100,000 and 1 million simultaneous users. But it's a good sense of where blockchain technology is, because they're the leading cloud storage provider in using blockchain. And I could give you a few other examples. I mean, then there's like CryptoKitties that took off, where it's breeding cats online, and it took over, it clogged like 30% of the Ethereum network and took it down for a few days. And so that's a good example of scalability not being there, but it's also a good example of one of the few applications that really has taken off and could be maybe considered the killer app that everyone's looking for. Although what I could also mention is that it took off for this time period, and then I think it's sort of tapered off as well. So, the market's still talking. I don't think there's no clear winner yet, but it's fun as we've seen this year progress that we're seeing more and more examples of applications with real users and real use cases. These are the three that feel, there's consensus, there's unanimous conversation about what they are. And one is privacy and resolving those concerns, because on one hand, the system is set up for transparency, which is in a lot of ways really wonderful. And then on the other hand, you can trace Bitcoin transactions, and different groups have done so. And that means that my account in Bitcoin is actually not private, meaning my identity is not private, because of different ways you can figure out what someone's private key, what person that relates to. And then beyond that, how much I'm storing is not private either. And so there's different reasons why that's not a good thing. Scalability, I mentioned just now with CryptoKitties as a good example, but the point is no one's figured out, what it would look like to scale up with millions of users. And one of the big challenges, with Ethereum, for example, it's something like they can process 15 transactions a second, and Visa can process 45,000 transactions a second. So we're just nowhere near where we would need to be to have this really take off in a real way. So those are probably the top two. There's regulation, which changes on the daily of what the SEC is saying. And it's not just the SEC, there's the CFTC, there's a bunch of organizations that have different reasons to have an opinion and, jurisdiction or whatever it might be, where they are meant to be regulating some part of this ecosystem. So I think that's a big question. That opens up also the question of, there's this ongoing debate of whether a currency and a token is a utility token or a security token. And if it's a security token, it has to be registered with the SEC and follow certain guidelines. And if it's a utility, then it doesn't. But since there's right now, like I mentioned, there's so few applications that have had that have had real use and like product market fit. And so then arguably nothing is yet a utility token. And so, and even if a company should have a utility down the line, me as an investor or any investor, we're investing today and it's at a white paper stage. So there's no actual product yet. And so arguably then we're back into the security world, even if it's meant to be a utility. So it's really, there's a lot of layers in how to think about it, but those are a couple of the challenges. Sure. And I thought a lot about this because I wrote that investment white paper for my team to figure out how do we look at this space. And the buckets that I would give you are as follows. The first would just be the idea of borderless markets and that they're available every hour of the day, every day of the week. And that just hasn't happened before. And then you can think about decentralized exchanges, things like Open Bazaar, that is kind of like the eBay, but decentralized. But also there's data exchanges. For example, you and I, if we have a Fitbit, we can actually, therefore, with this infrastructure, own our own data and then could sell it to an AI startup or consumers of that data. And that's a really big shift where if you think about Facebook, where if you don't pay anything, you're the product. And so it shifts gears where we're not the product, but we actually own our data and can monetize it. So markets are really interesting. Another bucket would be just the three elements of computing. So that's storage, compute, and communications. Storage, there's solutions like Filecoin and Sia, and that's that's one bucket. And then the compute would be organizations like Golem, where it allows a peer-to-peer renting of computer processing power to perform tasks like rendering. Then on the communication level, there's a team called Blockstack that's a decentralized browser platform, and it allows users to manage their identity data and token accounts to better connect and interact with dApps or decentralized applications. So that's the second bucket. A third bucket would be supply chain. And this one's interesting because it's promising, but it really has critical challenges that need to be addressed when implemented. And so some of the bigger companies are playing here, like Maersk, it's tracking shipping cargo. IBM is working towards transparency not IBM. Walmart is working on food transparency. In particular, they had a problem in China with pork and food safety. But some of the challenges that are there are risk-averse companies just changing their complex processes. These are mega companies, and unifying multiple companies with different pricing incentives to the same digital thread, and then successfully tying physical assets to a digital chain. And that may sound like that's something you could easily get past, but the value of the blockchain is that you really have full trust in the data. And if the data doesn't have full integrity because you don't have controlled ingress and egress data endpoints, then the value is no longer there. So that's a big one. And moving on from that, fourth bucket would be identity and self-sovereign identity, where I don't need the government to give me my identity, but rather I can establish it myself. So there's a company called Evernym that's working on that, and they have like the state of Illinois is partnering with them to store birth certificates, which is pretty interesting. And there's a place in Switzerland called Zug, and it's known as Crypto Valley, and they have an identity project that's pretty interesting. And Zug, by the way, separate from identity, in Switzerland, you can actually use Bitcoin to pay for like tuition at school. So it's really an interesting place. Okay, and the last bucket would just be futuristic potential applications. And so there's different solutions that enable interoperability between different blockchains. And as we're seeing, a couple thousand tokens, and only the forecast likely will only show us that more and more tokens will be created, it's especially interesting to see how we might be able to connect these different blockchains. And a non-blockchain example is how do PayPal and Venmo talk? And right now they don't. So that would be what it'd be like, but in blockchain, with two blockchains being able to talk. And then maybe one other example of a futuristic application would be stablecoin, and this idea that there would be, some decentralized autonomous organization monitoring exchange rates and adjusting the token supply to minimize volatility, which we've seen so much of in the last year plus. I'm really interested in digital asset marketplaces. And one that's pretty interesting that's in our competition called the Frontier Innovation Awards right now is creating digital wills for digital assets and creating insurance for those assets. Another that is pretty cool is allowing open source developers to also monetize and create ways to monetize that open source work when enterprises want to use some of what they've created. Right now, any company needs certain picks and shovels in the industry. And so that's also a space I'm looking in where, for example, everyone's struggling with custody solutions. Even the hedge funds that are the pros in this industry struggle and have to store their assets on a lot of different hardware wallets, but basically that's a challenge that everyone's facing. So I'm looking at some of those. They're a little bit less sexy, but they absolutely need to be there, and they're the infrastructure of this industry. Or things like you can't set up recurring payments right now with blockchain systems, and so the one solution I looked at is setting that up. And some of the examples I'm giving right now, I'd call them airplanes. They're inevitable. They're going to happen. They're things you and I can talk about, and we don't need to think so creatively to think this is going to happen, but they're still mission critical to blockchain being to taking off. I also think things like genetic data on the blockchain is pretty interesting, and apparently 90+% of our data is actually the same. So if you store those differences and know what those differences are, that's a way to actually, if these different institutions and organizations and research groups are on this same blockchain, and I'm thinking of a specific example, that actually is a way that science can flourish, and in a way that right now a lot of the data is a little more siloed. So you can hear in the examples I'm giving that actually I prefer digital assets over physical right now. And that's because there's just one more step to get the physical onto the digital chain. And we have enough challenges and problems working in the digital chain on its own. Yeah. So I'm starting there. We're still looking for a high quality team. We're looking for generational companies that are changing the game. That doesn't change at all. We're looking for, a huge market size. We're looking for a product that comes from that deep market insight. So really those things are the same considerations. There's a heavier emphasis on technical capability, and that is maybe the one thing I would draw out, is because there's such a lack of experience in the space, that can be a really big determining factor of how seriously should we be taking this team. And then I guess alongside that, like I mentioned, this deep market insight, if you're trying to disrupt an industry, then we're really looking for experienced founders. Even take blockchain out, we have 50 companies we've invested in, and they all have different metrics because they're all in different businesses. And like to give you just a little more, it's like, okay, I mentioned digital asset management.
Yeah.
You can manage land title. You could manage liquid real estate assets. You could manage like IP on the blockchain and data infrastructure and cloud storage and different tokens that have to do with privacy. So to think any of those would have a set of metrics that I would say apply to all of them is just not how we're looking at it. But each of them for sure, as they show up or as we get in conversation, we talk to the team or we talk amongst our team and say, well, what makes sense? What would be an indicator that this is taken off? What would be an indicator that that there's a captive market that's interested in this product? And this is also what I'm sharing is when you're pre-product market fit, you don't have a lot of metrics and you're growing into being able to measure more things. And so another comment I would make to you about blockchain in general is, from my perspective or my seat as an investor, teams shouldn't be raising money through an ICO, which is giving access to their product or service to future users. I don't think they should do that until they've achieved product market fit, because then you're putting the asset into the hands of end users. But often there's many pivots that need to happen up into the point of an end user using what you've built. And so that's just another strong opinion I have about the space. Generally speaking, I think events can be good ways to meet investors. We meet a lot of founders and other VCs at events, but it still can be a good way. A personal introduction goes so far. And, and I guess it goes back to just be authentic about where your interest lies. And so it's great if you've got a deep market insight. And if you don't, work toward that and be honest and say, this is where I'm coming from, and I've surrounded myself with these people, and this is the problem we're tackling. I'd love your advice. And start with asking for advice. And then because a lot of this is about building relationships. So it may be a while before you really get an in-person conversation or an investment, but there's a lot of ways to start planting the seed early. There's a couple groups that I would say to seek out. Generally, there's a lot of conversation about supporting not just female founders, but female VCs too. And so there's a group recently that's been created called All Raise. That's a very impressive group of female VCs that have that interest in both female VCs, but also female founders. Reach out to that group. There's another group of VCs, I'm forgetting the name, but they do office hours specifically for women in blockchain. There's a group called Team Block Society, and it's this really active Slack channel that we all support each other when I want to learn about this area of blockchain called a DAG, or what a layer 2 scaling solution might look like. For example, there's another group called 51%. And by the way, these groups that I'm mentioning are open to any woman. So I think go to female pitch events, go to meetups. I've supported a lot of female founders that have approached me at those. I'll always look at their decks and give them feedback. And because B only makes 7 investments a year, that means pretty much the vast majority I'm not going to be able to invest in, but nonetheless, I'm invested in wanting to support them. So I think there's definitely ways to connect. And what I would also say is that wealth in our world is really synonymous with power right now. And so if we want to see women in power, then I want to help women and I want to see other women help each other to create wealth and redeploy that wealth into helping other women grow, amazing businesses. And the way to do that, it's often this topic, it's so hard to foster diversity, but let's empower women, let's hire them, let's give them capital. Right now, we're in a huge wealth creation cycle, one of the largest in this decade, but maybe this century. And so, I don't want women to miss out. And my sense is that there's more and more women that are maybe investing or are in these positions that want to help other women. it is an incredibly tough journey, blockchain or not, and find the right partners to surround yourself with,
Yeah.
because you're not going to be able to do it alone, and and invest in business fundamentals. And it's easy right now, especially in blockchain, to take some shortcuts because there's a lot of money flowing in. But if you're really in it to win it, in it for the long term, build the foundations for a lasting business, and you'll and keep iterating and pivoting the way early stage companies do, and you'll find your path to success. And even if it leads to something else that's not that initial venture you started out with.